Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Chaf Beis Amud Aleph, 22a of Maseches Kiddushin. We're on the very last word of the page, so we're basically on to 22b, Chaf Beis Amud Beis. The very bottom it says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. Top of the next page. Ilu Nemar Ozno Badeles, had the verse said, his ear in the door, Hayisi Omer Yidkar Keneged Ozno Badeles. I would have said that you pierce the door next to his ear. Meaning, we have a pasuk, the verse says, you should take the awl, the peg, which you use for piercing, Binasata Bi'ozno Uvadeles, and you should put it, and it says, Bi'ozno, in his ear, Uvadeles, and in the door. So it says both, in his ear, in the door. So the Gemara says, if it hadn't said in his ear, but rather it said, Vinasata, you should place Ozno, his ear, Badeles, take the awl, and place his ear in the door, then, or place his ear in the door, I would have interpreted it to mean, it would be a bit of a strange verse. So what I would be forced to say is that it means take the awl, put his door against put his ear against the door, and then make the hole in the door, because it just said in the door. But that's not what it says. It says in his ear, in the door. So then I know that it means in his ear, in the door. So it says, again, from the top of the page, Ilu Namar Ozno Badeles, had it said his ear in the door, Hayisi Omer would have said Yidkar Keneged Ozno Badeles, that you should pierce, you should make the hole next to his ear in the door. And Deles in Ozno lo, but the hole is only in the door, not in his ear. Says the Gemara, why would I have thought that? How could I have thought that? The ozen lo, you would think that you don't put it in his ear? The Aksibar, I have another pasuk. The other pasuk says, V'ratza Adonav es azno ba'martzeya. It says that the master shall pierce his ear with an awl. So there it's very explicit that you pierce the ear. So even if our first pasuk had said, had not said in his ear, but we have another pasuk that says in his ear. So rather, says the Gemara, Hayisi Omer, what I would have said is, Yirtza'ena la'ozen me'avrai, v'yanichena al hadeles, v'yidkar kneri ozno badeles. What I would have said is, I have one pasuk that says that you should pierce his ear. I have another pasuk that says that you should pierce the door next to his ear. That's how we would be interpreting it. So how do you reconcile those? So this is what I would have said. I would have said, you pierce his ear, not against the door. You just, anywhere. You say, stand here. You pierce his ear. And then you put him up against the door and you pierce the door next to his ear. That's what I would have thought. Just to read it again. Hayisi Omer, I would have said, Yirtza'ena la'ozen me'avrai. Pierce his ear outside, meaning away from the door. V'yanichena al hadeles, and then place his ear against the door. V'yidkar kneged ozno badeles, and pierce next to his ear into the door. Talmud Omar, that's why the Torah says, Bi'ozno uvadeles, in his ear, in the door. HaKetzar, how do you do it in his ear, in the door? Which one is it? So it's kind of both. Dokir b'holech ad shemagia itzal deles. So what it means is, you drill in, you pierce his ear, you put his ear against the door, you pierce his ear until you reach the door. That's what it means. Bi'ozno uvadeles, in his ear, and in the door, you pierce his ear until you, get to the door. I don't think you would even have to make any hole in the door, although the pasuk sounds like maybe you should, but you pierce his ear up until the door. Says the Gemara, fine. Okay, so that's how you do it. Now, what kind of door? So, it says Deles. It says the door. Shomeya ani bein akura bein she'ina akura. So, I might say, it just has to be a door, whether it is uprooted or not uprooted, meaning whether the door is actually attached to a house or a room or anything, or whether it's just a door that's loose and lying on the ground. That's what I might have said. As long as it's a door's a door. Talmud Lomar, mezuzah. That's why the Torah says a mezuzah, which is the doorpost. What does it say? It says, Vigisho el hadeles o el hamezuzah, that you should put him up against the door or the doorpost. So, what do I see from that? That ma mezuzah ma'uma, just like that option to do it against the doorpost, it's something that stains, doorpost stains. Afdalas nami ma'uma, so too the door has to be standing, which means it has to be on its swivel, it can't be a loose door. Okay. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai hayadorish es hamikra hazeh kemin chomer. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would darshan, would learn out this pasuk, this idea of piercing his ear to make him a slave for longer, kemin chomer, like a beautiful piece of jewelry. And he would say as follows: Ma nishtana ozen mikol evarim shebaguf. Why is the ear different than all the other limbs? Meaning, why is it that we say pierce his ear? What's the significance of that? Pierce his nose, pierce something else. Why pierce his ear? So Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, or don't pierce anything really, I guess. But why the ear? So Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Kadosh Baruch Hu says, God says, Ozen sheshama koli al har Sinai. That ear that heard my voice on Har Sinai, Bisha she'amarti, at the time that I said, Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim. I said, and the Jewish people are my slaves, God says. They're my servants. And we learn they are my servants, God says, v'lo avadim la'avadim, and they should not be servants to my servants. A Jew should be a servant to Hashem, he shouldn't be a servant to a man. V'halach zeh. And this guy went, V'kana adam la'atzmo, and he acquired a master for himself. Yirtza, he should be pierced. So I guess what we're saying is the first time around when he first acquires a master, he's stuck. So fine, that we don't have to pierce his ear. But then he decides he wants to stay on longer past his initial term. He's not making extra money this way. He's doing it, he says, because he loves his master. He loves his wife, right? You're not supposed to be a slave to a man. You're supposed to be a slave and a servant to God. So therefore, we pierce his ear. We say, that ear that heard Hashem say, heard the commandment, not necessarily directly from Hashem, but heard the idea, if you leave B'nai Yisrael avadim, that B'nai Yisrael are avadim to me, are slaves to me, Hashem says, and not slaves to slaves. And then he went and made himself a slave. His ear should be pierced. Reb Shimon b'Rabbi Ayadarish the Mikra Hazeh Kamin Chomer. And Reb Shimon, the son of Rabbi, also expounded on this verse, Kamin Chomer, like a beautiful piece of jewelry. And he said as follows, Ma nishtana deles umezuzah mikol kelim shevabayis. Why the door, or the doorpost, out of all the things in the house to stand him up against? Do it against the table, do it against the wall. Why do we pierce his ear against the doorpost, or against the mezuzah, against the door or the doorpost? So Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, God says, Deles umezuzah, the door and the doorpost, Shahayu Edim b'Mitzrayim, they were witnesses in Egypt. Bisha shepasachti ala mashkov yashtei mezuzos, when I, God says, passed over the doorpost, the lintel, and the doorpost that had blood on them, V'amarti, and I said, Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim, that the Jewish people are slaves to me, because that's what it was initially said, in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. I said, the Jewish people are slaves to me, V'lo avadim la'avadim, and they're not slaves to slaves. V'otzeisim me'avdu, so there's like, I'm going to take them out from servitude to freedom. So the doorposts and the lintels, they were witness to God sort of, singling out or help, assisting the Jewish people in their leaving Egypt, because they are slaves to him and they're not to be slaves to man. V'halach zeh, and this guy went, V'kana adam la'atzmo, he acquired a master for himself, Yirtza b'fneim, he should be pierced in front of my witnesses, in front of the door and the doorpost, who are witnesses to the idea that Hashem passed over the Jewish houses to save them and to ultimately take them out of Mitzrayim. announcing that they are not to be slaves to people, they are to be slaves only to Hashem. And here, this guy went and made himself a slave. That's why the piercing is done in the ear that heard that idea, and that's why the piercing is done on the doorpost or the door, because they are witnesses to Hashem's passing over and help and assisting the Jewish people in getting out of servitude. Okay, the Mishnah says, Eved Kinani. So now we're moving on to the ways of acquiring a non-Jewish slave, a Canaanite slave. Eved Kinani nikna b'kesef u'b'shtar v'chazaka. Eved Kinani, a Canaanite slave, can be acquired in 3 ways. At least the Mishnah mentions 3 ways. Kesef, money. Shtar, a document. And chazaka. Chazaka is certain acts that demonstrate ownership, as we'll see in the Gemara. V'kones atzmo b'kesef al yedei acherim. And he could acquire himself back with money. He could redeem himself. But the money has to be other people's money. Because if he would acquire money, it would immediately become the master's. So the slave, as a slave, can never actually acquire any money to use to redeem himself. So in order to be redeemed with money, the money has to belong to others, and they have to give it directly to the master. It can never come through the possession of the slave. So he could acquire himself back with money belonging to others, uvishtar al yedei atzmo, or with a shtar, with a document that he accepts from the master. If the master gives him a document of freedom, a shtar shichror, a document of freedom, so then he could go free. Divrei Rabbi Meir, that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. The Chachamim Omrim, and the Chachamim say, B'kesef al yedei atzmo, that actually he could free himself through money that belongs to himself. Uvishtar al yedei acherim, and a document even others can accept on his behalf. Uvilvad sheyakesef mishalachem, but the money has to belong to others. So what are they saying differently than Rabbi Meir? Rabbi Meir said that the others have to give the money directly. The Chachamim are saying the money has to belong to others, but the slave is actually allowed to take possession of it and give it to the master. And that has to be done, meaning that they have to give it to the slave on condition that the master doesn't have any rights to it. And according to the Chachamim, that works. According to Rabbi Meir, apparently that doesn't work. A third party cannot give money to a slave and say, this is for you, and I'm only giving it on condition that the master has no rights to it. That won't work. The master will still have rights. That's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. The opinion of the Chachamim is that would work. So it's possible for him to take possession of something if it's given to him by others. Now, he can't do that on his own. If he decides he's going to open a business and start making money, then earning money, that belongs to the master. But if somebody gives him money as a matana, as a gift, and it does it on condition that the master doesn't have any rights to it, so that, it seems, would work, and that, according to the Chachamim, that's another way that he could redeem himself with that money. Okay. The Gemara says, Mi nolan. From where do I know that an Eved Kanani can be acquired in these 3 ways with kesef, shtar, and chazaka, with money, or a document, or a chazaka, an act of taking possession? Tichsiv, because the pasuk says, V'isnachatem osam livnechem acharechem l'reshes achuzah. It says with regards to Canaanite slaves that you will inherit them, transfer them to your children after you as a inheritance, as an achuzah, as an ancestral inheritance. Says the Gemara, Hikishan hakasav l'stei achuzah. So the pasuk compares them to a field of inheritance, because it calls a Canaanite slave an inheritance. So we compare it to a stei achuzah, an ancestral field of inheritance. And mas stei achuzah nikna b'kesef b'shtar b'chazaka, just like a field that's an inheritance can be acquired through any of these 3 ways: kesef, shtar, chazaka, money, a document, or an act of possession, a chazaka. That will be learned out in the Gemara later. So af Eved Kanani nikna b'kesef b'shtar b'chazaka. So an Eved Kanani, a Canaanite slave, who's compared to the field, the ancestral field, also can be acquired in any of these 3 ways. So the Gemara says, so if you're really comparing them, let's go with it. Let's go all the way. So you should say then that just like an ancestral field gets returned to the original owner at the Jubilee year, at the Yovel, so too you should say Evet Kanani goes back to the owner at the at the Jubilee year. I suppose that would be to himself. So he should be freed at the Yovel year. So the Gemara says, no, that's not the case. Talmud Elamai, that's why the Torah says, Olam Bahem Ta'avodu. That same verse that we were quoting before, with the inheritance of the Canaanite slave, it says, Olam Bahem Ta'avodu, you shall rule over them forever. So we see that once a Canaanite slave, always a Canaanite slave, unless redeemed by the master. But otherwise, Olam Bahem Ta'avodu, you rule them forever, and they do not go free at Yovel. So even though we're learning from a ste'achuza, from an ancestral field, that's limited. It's limited to the ways to acquire, kasef shtar or chazaka, but it does not include that it goes back at Yovel. The Canaanite slave will not go back at Yovel because it says Olam Bahem Ta'avodu, that you shall rule over them forever. Tana was taught in a brisa, af b'chalipin, that a Canaanite slave can also be acquired with the kinyan chalipin. Kinyan chalipin we learned about early on in the Masechta. It's like a sort of a swap, where one person gives like just something that doesn't even have to have any value. Doesn't even have to be a shavapruta. But I give a handkerchief to you, and you pick it up and take possession of that, and that swaps over whatever you're giving to me. So a Canaanite slave can also be acquired in that fashion. So I guess you would give it, if he has another owner, you could give him the handkerchief to the owner, and he would lift it up, and that would transfer over the Canaanite slave. I suppose if he's selling himself, that something like that could also work. So that's another way to acquire the Canaanite slave. So why didn't our Mishnah mention it? Our Mishnah says he's acquired with money, a document, or a chazak. It doesn't say chalipin, this other type of kinyan. So the Gemara explains that Tana Didan, our Tana, didn't include that because Milsa de Lesu and Metatal and Katani. Our Tana, the author of our Mishnah, is only mentioning ways of acquisition that are not relevant to metaltlin. Metaltlin are movable objects, as opposed to like a property. So a movable object, like a sefer, that's acquired. You can use chalipin to acquire this. You cannot use chalipin. You step back. You could, I think, use chalipin to acquire a field also, but our Tana is specifically saying ways that you cannot acquire metaltlin. So kesef, shtar, and chazaka with money, a document, and chazaka, you cannot use those things to acquire metaltlin. Okay, acquisition with kesef, with money, is its own story in itself, machlokes. But the Gemara right now is assuming you can't acquire metaltlin with kesef. So the Gemara says, Tana Didan, our Tana, Milsa de Lesim and Metaltlin Katani. It's only listing the modes of acquisition that you cannot use for metaltlin. But Milsa de Yisim and Metaltlin Lo Katani. But methods of acquisition that are relevant to metaltlin, to movable objects, it's not mentioning. So, and I guess that's kind of, maybe it's saying it's obvious that if you could use it for metaltlin, you could use it for an eved, to acquire a slave. So since chalipin, this type of swap kinyan of acquisition, could be used to acquire regular movable objects, metaltlin, it didn't mention it here in the Mishnah, but it's still true that it can be used to acquire a slave as well. Amar Shmuel said, Eved Kinani Nikna b'Mashicha. Shmuel says there's another way you could acquire another kinyan, another mode of acquisition that works for a Eved Kinani, a Canaanite slave, and that is Mashicha. Mashicha means to pull something to you. So Ketzat, so how do you acquire an Eved Kinani with Mashicha? Takfo ubaetzlo kano. If you pull him, or you like sort of overpower him, and he comes, you pull him towards you, that's a kinyan. that works to acquire him. But karo uba etzlo lo kano. But if you just call him, you say, come here, and he comes, that would not be an acquisition. Even though you pull him towards you with your voice, but that doesn't work to acquire him. So Shmuel's telling us another way to acquire with Mashiach. You pull him towards you, that will also acquire him. So Bishlam Latana Didan. So I understand, according to our Tana, why it wasn't mentioned here in the Mishnah, because we already said, Milsa de Isa b'metaltali lo katani. We're not mentioning modes of acquisition that you can use for movable objects, for metaltaling. And Mashiach would work on metaltaling to acquire, to affect the transaction of metaltaling and make it mine. If I do Mashiach, it becomes mine. So therefore, the Mishnah didn't mention this mode of acquisition, because we're not mentioning those modes of acquisition that can be used to acquire metaltalin. However, right, so milsa de isa b'metaltali lo katani. Modes of acquisition that also work for other movable objects, it's not mentioning in our Mishnah. Delesa b'metaltali katani, we're only mentioning the ones that don't work by movable objects. Elo latana v'ra, but according to the author of the Brisa, which mentioned, in addition to, felt the need to mention chalipin, the mode of acquisition of swapping. So we see that Brisa, the author of that Brisa, is willing to mention, feels the need to mention modes of acquisition that work for other metaltalin. So why didn't he mention Mashicha, pulling? Nisni Mashicha, let him say Mashicha also. So the Gemara says, Ki Katani, the Tan of the Brisa, his list is Milsa de Isa Bing B'Mekarkai Bing B'Metaltali. He's only mentioning modes of acquisition that work both on karka, on land, and on metaltali, on movable objects. But Meshicha de Metaltali, Isa B'Mekarkai Leisa, Lo Katani. But Meshicha, pulling, which works on metaltali, on movable objects, but does not work on karka, on land. You can't pull land, and you can't acquire it, because you can't do it. Lo katani, so it doesn't mention it. So the Brisa is limiting itself to only mentioning the modes of acquisition that work for both metaltaling and karka. So that's why actually his list seems to only include one thing, which is chalipin. That's the only thing, at least it seems, that would work on both karka and metaltalin, and movable objects. So the Gemara says, now the Gemara will examine what it just said earlier. So we said that the way to acquire through Mashicha is you pull it towards you by force, you pull him towards you by force, that acquires him, but if you call him and he comes, that does not acquire him. Right? We said, Ketzad, how do you do it? Takfo ba'atzlo kana. If you pull him by force and he comes, then you acquire him. But karo, if you just call him, ba'atzlo and he comes, lo kana, that does not acquire him. Says the Gemara, why not? Vikaro lo, calling him over does not acquire him. V'atanya, but we have a Brisa. The Brisa is talking about an animal. And it says, Ketzad b'mesira. How do you acquire an animal with mesira? Mesira means like to pass it. But, but it involves, I guess, similar acts to Mashicha. Sorry, no, it's going to say Mashicha separately. So Ketzad b'mesira. How do you acquire it? Through passing it. So, I guess if one owner is passing it to the other, at what point does the receiver acquire the animal? So it says, Achzav, if he grabs it, betalfa, either on the foot, the hoof, bisara, by the hair, be'ukaf, by the saddle, shaleh, that's on it, bishlif shaleh, or by the load that it's carrying, beprumya shabapia, by the bit that's in its mouth, ubezuk shabitzavara, by the bell that's on its neck, kana, all those work to acquire through masira. If one owner is passing it to the other, when the owner grabs it, when the new owner grabs it, any of these things, at that point he acquires it. Ketzad b'mashicha. How does a new owner acquire something through mashicha, through pulling, acquiring animal? Koreh la v'hiba. If he calls it and he comes, He says, Betsy, come here. And the cow comes. Oh, sheikisha b'makal v'ratz. So he hits it with a stick, and it runs, v'ratz lefanov, and it runs in front of him. Kevon she'akra yad v'regel kana. As soon as it lifts its hand and foot, so I guess front and back legs, that's a king, and that's an acquisition. He has caused it to walk. Rabbi Yassi v'amri Rabbi Acha omer. Some say it's Rabbi Acha says, Ad she'tahalech lefanov nolo kumasa. You don't require the animal until it walks a distance of its full height. Fine, but either way, either it walks by just lifting the front leg and the back, or it walks by walking the length of its full height. But the Brisa says that if you call the animal and it comes, that acquires it. So how come when it comes to an animal, and we talk about Mashicha, the kinging of pulling it towards you, we say that calling it and having it come works, but when it comes to a Canaanite slave, you're doing a kinging of Mashicha, if you're doing a kinging of Mashicha pulling it towards you, but instead of pulling it, you call him and he comes, we say then that doesn't work. How come? So they explained, Behema adaita demara azla. When an animal comes by being called, it's responding to the will of the master. It doesn't have its own will. So if it's called and it comes, it's acting by the will of the master. But a slave, a human being, adaite denafsheka azal, he's going on his own free will. And that will not create a kinyan, an acquisition. If I pull him towards me against his will, then that's an acquisition. But if I call him and he comes of his own free will, that's not an acquisition. Rav Ashi said, Eved katan kibehema dami. But if the slave was a child, so then it would be like an animal as well. Because there also, a child is not considered to have his own intellect. And therefore, if he responds and walks based on the calling, it's not his own das, it's not his own will, it's the will of the master that he's exercising by walking. And therefore, Rav Ashi says that for a child slave, it would work to acquire him if the master calls him and he comes. Okay, Tana Rabban and the rabbis taught. Ketzad b'chazaka. So one of the ways we mentioned in the Mishnah to acquire a slave is with chazaka. Chazaka is an act that demonstrates possession. And that can actually affect possession. That can create the transaction that brings it into his possession. So for example, hitir lo minalo. If the slave unties your shoes, unties the master's shoes, that shows mastery, and that will acquire the slave. Oh, or he carried his things for him to the bathhouse. Hifshito, if he helped him undress. Hirchitzo, if he helped him wash. Sacho, if he anointed him in oils. Gardo, or if he rubbed him to clean him off. Hilbisho, if he got him dressed. Hinilo, if he put on his shoes. Higbiho, if the slave lifted him up. Kano, he acquires him. Amar of Shimon. So all those things are chazaka. So again, these acts of service that demonstrate mastery, so these are all chazaka and would create a transaction for the master to acquire the slave. Now the last thing we said was higbio, if the slave picked up the master. So Amar Reb Shimon said, Lote chazaka gedola mehagba, that a kinyan, an acquisition through the method of chazaka, of demonstrating possession, shouldn't be better than the acquisition of hagba'ah, of lifting something up. Shagba'ah kona b'chol makom, lifting something up acquires in any situation. That's what Reb Shimon said. And the Gemara says, my kamar, what is Reb Shimon saying? What's he responding to when he says that? Again, the Tanakama, the first time of the Mishnah said, if he picks him up, he acquires him. And then Reb Shimon says that chazaka shouldn't be better than hagba'ah. A chazaka is an act that shows possession, should not be better than hagba'ah, than lifting something up. Hagba'ah works everywhere. My kamar, what is Reb Shimon saying? So Amar Rav Ashi says, Higbio hu l'rabo kano. That the Tanakama, the first opinion is saying, if Higbio hu l'rabo, if he picked up his master, meaning the slave lifted up his master, an act of service, Kano, the master now acquires the slave through that. But Higbio rabo lo, but what if the master picked up the slave? Does the master acquire the slave that way? Lo. Kano. The Tanakama, the first opinion, says that does not require the slave. If the master picks up the slave, doesn't acquire him. And because that's not an act of service of the slave to the master. So to that, Amar Rabbi Shimon said, Lo te chazaka gadol me hagba. Chazaka shouldn't be greater than hagba, than raising up. Shagba kona b'chol makom, because hagba works anywhere. In other words, Rabbi Shimon saying, you're too focused on the kinging of chazaka. And he's saying, maybe you're right, that if the master picks up the slave, he won't acquire the slave through chazaka, but what about hagbah? There's a kinyan, there's a way to acquire something by lifting it up. So if the master lifts up the slave, forget it, maybe it doesn't show possession and won't work through chazaka, but it will work through hagbah. That's its own kinyan, that's its own way to make a acquisition, to effect a transaction, is to lift the object up. That requires it. So therefore Reb Shimon says that hagbah, that the master picking up the slave, will also work. So the Gemara says, Hashta de amar tigbio hu lerabo kano. So if you're telling me that if the slave picks up the master in an act of service, that he acquires the master, that the master acquires the slave, so then elamiata, so now shifcha kananis tikna bebia, a Canaanite maidservant should be acquired with bia, with intercourse. We learned earlier in the Masechta that a shifcha kananis is not acquired through bia. That wasn't on the list. It didn't make the list of ways that she's acquired. But according to this, when a slave picks up the master acquires the slave. So when a Canaanite maidservant, if she would have relations with the master, she would cause him to be raised up physically on top of her. And so he should acquire her that way, because she's performing an act of service, so to speak, of picking him up. So the Gemara says, Kika Amrinan, when do we say that if the slave picks up the master, that makes an acquisition, because it's an act of service, that's when Zenenev is Emitztire. That's when the master benefits and the slave suffers. He's picking up this heavy master, so he's suffering, and the master's benefiting. That shows mastery of the master over the slave. That's a chazaka, that's an acquisition. But in this case, if the master is having relations with the maidservant, zenenev is zenenehu. That's not an act of service necessarily. They're both benefiting. They're both experiencing pleasure, and therefore that would not work as an act of acquisition, because the master is not the only one benefiting here. So the Gemara says, Shalo kedarka ma'yekol neimar. What if he would perform intercourse on her shalo kedarka in an abnormal way? So anally, where she would not experience the same sensation of pleasure, and he still would, and so that would be a pleasure for him and not for her, and you would still have that hagbah going on, that he's being raised up. So maybe that should work. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Achai bar Ada d'min Acha. Rav Achai bar Ada from Acha said, Man lema l'adulav hana isluhu l'jarbayu. He says, first of all, who says that they don't both have pleasure? It could be that she'll experience some pleasure from there also. And furthermore, mishkevei isha ksiv. When the Torah talks about the prohibition of homosexuality, it describes it as mishkevei isha, and it's plural there. Mishkevei isha, the ways of lying with a woman. So there's a way to lie with a woman, which is the normal way, and there's a way to lie with a woman, which is the abnormal way. And in the context of homosexuality, the Torah forbids both with a man. But here, I mean, okay, that's its own story, obviously. But what we see from there, what we derive from there is that because it's plural, he mentions both in the same context, normal and abnormal intercourse. So then, what we learn is Ikisha Kasav Kedarka L'Shalo Kedarka. We learn to compare when it's the normal way to the abnormal way. And therefore, since over here we learned that when Bia, that the master cannot acquire a maidservant through Bia in the normal way, so then we would extend that and say there's a hekish, there's a comparison of abnormal Bia to normal Bia, that just like normal Bia, normal intercourse will not work for the master to acquire the maidservant, so we extend that, whether all the logic comes with it or not, all the reasoning comes with it, we'll still extend it because of the hekish, because of this comparison that says that just like it can't work in the normal way, so too it's not going to work in the abnormal way. And therefore, a master will not acquire a maidservant through Bia. Okay, we'll pick up here next time.